everyone. Maren Guba and I are delighted to be here with you today. We are going to talk about psychological safety, which I think is a great follow-up to the keynote session that we were just listening to. I'm Debbie Hennelly. I've been around for a long time in this field. My original work was as an environmental lawyer, which I rolled into ethics and compliance in the late 90s. And spent about a little more than 10 years in-house in various compliance roles, including a general counsel and chief compliance officer role in a couple of companies. I'm the founder and president of this company, Resility. We do ethics and compliance, leadership, consulting, and coaching. This is my colleague, Maren Guba, and Maren's going to tell you about herself.
Thank you, Debbie. Hi, my name is Maren Gube. My background includes an earlier career as an executive in manufacturing. I transitioned over to the academic side because I was really curious, particularly in the areas of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. Why is it that some people can create and innovate with what they learn and others cannot? So connecting those experiences has led me to culture, particularly around workplace emotions and psychological safety. So I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you, Debbie.
Okay, so let's get started. We have, I hope everyone can see the slides. We have a few things that we'd like to cover today. We want to share perspectives on psychological safety and its benefits. It has benefits beyond just the speaking up framework that we talk about in ethics and compliance, which is actually how Maren and I connected. We had a lot of interest in psychological safety in common, and then shared with each other that, my use of it is in the speaking up and culture of integrity framework, and hers is in innovation and inclusion. And so we want to talk to you about how we can help leaders create these kinds of environments and make the best use of it for their organizations. We're going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to talk first about the power of a culture of candor generally. So speaking up and transparency generally has these various benefits. And then Maren's going to talk about what psychological safety is and how we create it. And then we're going to come back and talk about how we drive that kind of culture change in our organizations. So first, let's talk about our usual frames. We have the sentencing guidelines and the various prosecutorial guidance documents that encourage us to create cultures of ethical conduct and compliance, and of course to have a helpline or some other mechanism for employees to speak up. And of course, we also have the high quality ethics and compliance program principles that ECI has developed for us. But these are not the only reasons to have a speaking up culture, and that's what we want to talk about. When we try to engage our colleagues, they're, especially on the business side, they're used to talking about culture from an organizational standpoint. It supports all kinds of benefits in the business. But Peter Drucker, who is known as the godfather of management philosophy, is often quoted as saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think we would say that if that's the case, culture eats our programs for lunch. So how do we go about meeting that culture where it is? How do we go about ensuring that what we're doing doesn't get either swallowed up or spit out or chewed up or ignored by the existing culture and the leadership of the company? I think this is where I would love to share with you some of the reasons. I'm about to give you sort of a Debbie Summer reading book report. My very first mentor, when I went in-house in the early 90s, told me that, and he's a lawyer, still is, he's actually chief compliance officer now. He told me that the best way to get the attention of the business people is obviously to understand the business, and then to also be able to understand how they think, to read what they're reading, to understand their strategy, what they're competing against, and so forth. And so he recommended that I buy a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, which I did, and to what was then Business Week, which I did, and to Harvard Business Review, which I did, and still read faithfully. It really helped me understand how they approach culture and how they approach leadership. And as my practice grew to have a focus on ethical leadership and culture over the last maybe 15 years, I've sort of had this self-directed micro MBA through reading books and my subscription to Audible and webinars, TED Talks, and so forth. And so I just wanted to point out for you some of the thought leadership that is really helpful and will get to understand how business people think about culture. In order to get them to understand why we talk about integrity, it's important to distinguish that we're not just talking about compliance, we're talking about the way they go about bringing our values to life. So in order to create that culture of integrity, we have to understand how they think about culture. This is, by the way, my definition of a culture of integrity, compliance being that floor for behavior. And they're, I think in many ways, expecting us to sort of stick to that realm, the legal compliance realm, maybe even policy compliance. But when we start talking about values and principles and going beyond what the law requires, we're talking about what we would call ethical behavior, but I think what we want them to see as operating with integrity. So how do we go about taking this framework and integrating it into the way they think and run the organization? Before I jump into my book report, Maren and I thought it would be fun to just get a sort of a pulse on where all of you are and what you think your role is in creating a culture of integrity. If you're watching us in Zoom, please remember that you have to go back to the impact homepage, the agenda where you found us, and next to the file and chat tabs, you'll see a poll tab. Maren, I'll give this to you.
Right. So what role do you yourself feel that you have in creating that culture of integrity? Are you included in the decision making? B, consulted in the decision making? C, informed after decisions are made? Or D, are you not sure where you stand now? Okay, let's see. All right. Well, so far we've got almost half who are feeling that they are consulted in the decision making. That's a pretty high percentage, actually.
That's great.
10% are not sure where they stand. I feel you.
I do. I feel you too.
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like the voting has slowed down. So let's talk about how we get into that included role. How do we make ourselves part of the decision-making process, or invited to the table, as they say? I guess this is where I should quote Shirley Chisholm, who was a congresswoman when I was a little girl. She said, "When you're not invited to the table, bring a folding chair." So I guess this is where we're going to talk about folding chairs. Okay. Oopsie, sorry. So here's my first of my summer book reports. This book, The Culture Code, was a pretty hot book for the last few years on culture. And Daniel Coyle did a lot of research about high performing cultures. And he found these themes that are going to be sort of reverberating through a lot of what we're talking about today. He's particularly focused on belonging cues, which Maren will talk about as well in psychological safety. Then we have, so this isn't a book report, this is just something I highly recommend reading. Gallup does an enormous analysis of their engagement survey data I think it's every 4 years, because this is the most recent one. And they put it out in something called the State of the American Workplace Report. For those of you who have been doing your own culture surveys, I know that you also are probably very aware of employee engagement or employee perception surveys that are done usually by HR. Well, what Gallup showed in this most recent report is that only 3 in 10 employees strongly agree with the statement that their opinion matters at work. That's one of the Gallup 12 questions that are sort of the core of how they determine engagement and effectiveness for employees. Their calculation, by the way, is that if we could up that ratio from 3 in 10 to 6 in 10, we'd get this enormous jump in the reduction of turnover. I think very importantly, the reduction in safety incidents and a huge increase in productivity. So that engagement is really about ownership, feeling ownership in the work of the company or the organization. And ownership is something that we really want to hook onto, sort of hitch our wagon to that star when it comes to creating a culture of integrity. Amy Edmondson is another great thinker, thought leader in psychological safety, whom Marin's going to talk about. Her connections between psychological safety and teaming are really important to us, not just as ethics and compliance leaders, but also as leaders of teams, direct reports, cross-functional teams. And this is a great book to help you understand how to create that kind of a team. This is an oldie but goodie, probably one of the earliest things that I read about the importance of transparency and candor to not just productivity, but also to addressing problems before they snowball, which of course is a huge part of what we want to do in creating a culture of integrity, right? We want people to obviously tell us about problems with compliance, but we also want them to escalate issues when they feel that we're coloring outside the line somewhere when it comes to doing what's right. The idea that the flow of information is the intelligence of the organization, sort of the nervous system, I think is a really important visual for us to keep in mind. So in summary, there are these 3 things that are essential to our conversation. One is information flow that helps us create the culture of integrity, right? The early warning system, heading off microaggressions that can undermine our culture of inclusion, and then the ability to encourage creativity and innovation. That's these 3 sort of overlapping things, if you can think of a Venn diagram, are the reason we're focused on psychological safety today. But breaking down the barriers is a big issue for us, not just in speaking up, but in these other areas like innovation and inclusion. We know from the GBES, as well as research that's been done by other thought leadership, that the obstacles to speaking up include things like retaliation, which we were just talking about in the last session, a belief that no one's going to do something if I raise an issue. I would call that futility, or maybe even apathy. Nobody's going to listen or care or take action. And then just plain embarrassment. I don't want to look like a fool raising something that maybe nobody thinks is an issue. Then there are the observations of what other people are experiencing. So while that first bunch of bullets might be our personal perceptions, what we see other people experiencing, actual retaliation or a lack of follow through when we see other people raise issues, or we see that a supervisor doesn't really escalate or do anything, that's also going to chill the idea of speaking up or sharing ideas. And then finally, just plain not knowing where to go with a question or an issue, or the lack of an opportunity because my leader's not creating an environment where I feel like it's okay to speak up. So why would leaders fail to create that environment? What's going on? I would ask you to shout out your answers, but then we'd probably have dozens of people opening their mics. So instead, I think I'm going to turn it over to Marin to talk about what psychological safety is.
Thank you, Debbie. Just bear with me for 2 seconds while I open my presentation here. Okay, so thank you very much for that. Psychological safety is certainly a concept that we hear a lot about recently. Now, there's a seemingly never-ending parade of unsettling news, so the idea has exploded in as a result of that, but it's not new. So let's start by taking a quick look at where it came from. Now, we just heard about Warren Bennis. He worked with Edgar Schein at MIT, and they described psychological safety as the extent to which individuals feel secure and confident in their ability to manage change. Then William Kahn linked it to attitudes and behaviors, specifically the ones that are needed in creating trusting and supportive interpersonal relationships with work colleagues. And then we have Amy Edmondson, whom Debbie mentioned and who you probably have heard about. She does treat psychological safety as a team level climate, and she defined it as the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And most recently, Timothy Clark, who is an Oxford-trained scientist and consultant, has developed this evidence-based framework of the 4 stages of psychological safety. So in our session today, this is going to be the model that we are using because I am a certified trainer and coach in this approach. And here is the book cover. In looking at a concept, sometimes it's illuminating to think about the opposite of the concept. So what would be the opposite of psychological safety? Fear. Now, I don't have time to go deep into the neuroscience of it here, but a fear response, such as that you might get if this was coming at you from behind the next shrub, it has both a physiological and a neurological effect. You might have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. So the amygdala in your brain directs your body to release cortisol and epinephrine, which are stress hormones, and their purpose is to prepare you to find a way to keep yourself safe, whatever it takes. Now, whatever it takes is not, in this case, empathy. It's not an increase in trust, collaboration. It is not shared exploration or any kind of pro-social behavior, because those effects would be the results of oxytocin, which is the social hormone. And when you're afraid or stressed, your oxytocin goes on vacation. Now, we also have something we call mirror neurons in the brain, and they cause us to basically react and then reflect back into the environment what is happening immediately around us. Now, many of you work in the area of risk assessment and risk mitigation. Now, usually that refers to risks to your employer, financial risks or climate risks, geopolitical risk, technology risks, you name it. But humans are social animals, and without thinking about it, we are continually scanning the environment and conducting this interpersonal risk assessment. So that subconscious level of threat detection is going on all the time. Now, those brain pathways are working for us to help us decide whether, in the situation that we're in, whether we're going to display acts of vulnerability. Now, that could be something as simple as asking a question. So if our threat detection antenna tells us that it's safe, we offer a so-called performance response. However, if it's not safe, we are going to engage in self-preservation and risk minimization and basically respond with a survival response. Now, that could be something as simple as staying quiet instead of asking that question in a meeting. So the definition of psychological safety in this model is that it is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. What does that mean? If you want to, you can put in the chat, what does vulnerability mean to you? Or just think about it for yourself even. Obviously, the basic definition of the term vulnerability is that you're exposed to the possibility of harm or loss. In a social or work setting, what kind of harm or loss are we talking about? What are the risks? Again, something for you to think about or share in the chat if you'd like. Another way of putting it is that it's an environment where it is not expensive to be yourself. What does that mean? How can it be expensive to be yourself? Well, there are different buckets of expense, really. You can think of it as being expensive politically. It can be expensive economically, socially, emotionally, or psychologically. But if you have psychological safety, you don't have to spend anything. You can just be yourself without fear of retribution, marginalization, or humiliation. Now, as we are trying to determine whether a given environment is safe, What exactly is it that our threat detection antenna is looking for? How do we come to the conclusion that environment is safe or unsafe? Well, we look for two things. First, we look for acts of vulnerability. Second, we look for the response pattern to those acts of vulnerability. Now, I'm going to repeat this, and Debbie already alluded to this earlier, but it really bears repeating. First, we observe those acts of vulnerability around us. And second, most importantly, we look for how the bosses and our work environment responds to those acts of vulnerability. For example, if I'm in a large meeting and I ask a question and I happen to catch out of the corner of my eye that someone, maybe the boss down at the end of the conference table, rolled his or her eyes, that is obviously not a very safe situation, and I might not ask that question next time when the opportunity comes up. But let me ask you, does it really matter? Is it really that big a deal, if these acts of vulnerability are punished? Isn't this just how people are? Isn't this just, we should maybe just accept it and move on? Well, if we think about it, let's look at some ways in which vulnerability can be punished. Now, normally I would ask if you have experienced any of these, but I'm just going to read through them briefly, and you can reflect to see whether any have happened to you. Have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you been afraid to ask that question? Have you remained silent when you knew the answer? Have you had someone steal your idea or steal credit? Have you been ignored or interrupted? Have you felt that you were the target of negative stereotypes? Have you faced retaliation? Or have you been asked for feedback and yet it wasn't welcome? Have you been publicly shamed or made fun of? Have you been punished for making an honest mistake? Or have you ever been made to feel inferior? I can raise my hand. Yes, I think most of these have happened at some point. And in fact, according to research, 55% of people say that at least one of these has happened in the last 24 hours to them. So clearly these are common everyday occurrences. So again, so what? This is normal. Should we just accept it and not worry so much about it? Well, unfortunately, when a breach happens or when vulnerability is punished, three things kick into gear. First of all, the pain centers of the brain are activated. The self-censoring instinct of humans is triggered, and that combines to shift the individual to a defensive mode of performance. Now, over the long term, if there's a consistent pattern of punished vulnerability, the social, emotional, and psychological cost to the individual can be, obviously, but we also know that the cost to the company from these ongoing continual breaches of psychological safety are not limited just to the HR costs of lack of employee well-being. So let's move into the 4 stages and look at them individually a little bit. Now, anywhere that people get together, including here on Zoom, in an office, wherever people interact, there are 4 categories of activity that people engage in. They connect, they learn, they contribute, and they challenge when it's safe to do so. So the psychological safety aspect of it means that you feel included as you're connecting, you feel safe to learn, you feel safe to contribute, and you feel safe to challenge that status quo without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. Do you think there's a sequence to these? Is one harder than the other? Research does suggest that it is sequential and that these 4 things are a function of these 2 factors. So we have permission here on the x-axis, we have respect on the y-axis. They interact to give you different levels of safety. So the progression does tend to be clear, and that's because these 4 stages represent a universal human pattern. It cuts across cultures, it cuts across industries, it cuts across work roles, demographics, nations, it cuts across everything. It's universal. The first one is inclusion safety, because the very first thing that people look for when they interact with others is to have that feeling of being included and accepted and having that sense of belonging that Debbie alluded to earlier as well. If you don't have this level, it's very difficult to muscle through the fear to get to the next level. And most people don't, because it's just too expensive. For the second level, humans are innately wired to want to learn and grow and develop, basically to acquire new skills and abilities. So learner safety means that you can engage in all aspects of the learning process, again, without being punished. The next instinct is then to apply what we have learned, to contribute and to make a difference as a full member of the team. And finally, the highest level of challenger safety here is the riskiest and the most exposed. And this is where you feel that you can challenge the status quo without risking your standing or your reputation. Now, this is can be thought of as a ladder. We're climbing this ladder of vulnerability as we move up. So here you have the highest risk, vulnerability, and exposure. Sometimes we fall off the ladder. And one of the common problem areas here is what we refer to as exploitation, which is where we have high permission and low respect. So basically, in a situation like that, we value the person for the value that they create for the company, but we don't value them enough to give them the respect they deserve as a valuable person. So an example of this is unpaid overtime. I think we probably all, I'm gonna go out on a limb and venture that everybody in this webinar today has put in some unpaid overtime. That technically, that's exploitation. Now, in some areas, there's bullying. There can be some very subtle acts of harassment, manipulation, or even public shaming. And over time, these things get normalized and people accept it as just the way things are in those environments. So that is one of the main reasons this framework is so important. And we're going to look now at each of them in a little bit more detail. Now, each level includes a social exchange. So the social exchange identifies what each party needs to do to create psychological safety for that stage. Now, the first one being inclusion safety. The exchange here is that you get inclusion in exchange for, very simply, human status and the absence of harm. Simply, ethically, we have to extend inclusion safety to someone for being human and for not presenting our social unit with harm. I have a short little story about inclusion safety, actually. I moved to the east coast of Canada from Finland when I was in my teens, and at that time, my accent was much thicker than it is now. I was so worried about not making any friends and feeling like an outsider. But people in my high school on the east coast of Canada just had this inclusion exchange thing down pat. I felt included from the first week. Now, what did they do to make me feel that way? Well, they asked me things like, for example, how do you pronounce your name? They asked me about customs where I came from. For example, what are house parties like in Finland? They invited me to their homes, and I'm not kidding, on the very first Friday of my first week in that school, one of the girls in my class lived close to the school, and she invited me to her home for lunch one day. I've never forgotten that. And they not only shared food, obviously, but also information and resources and knowledge, both explicitly and implicitly. So when a team leader consistently engages in these behaviors that ask, invite, and share, this establishes a norm of inclusion in that environment. We have another poll for you. Debbie, do you want to go ahead and ask this one?
Sure, indeed we do. So you know where to go for the polling tab. This question is, how effective are you at providing inclusion safety? Are you asking? Are you inviting? Are you sharing? This goes not just for your direct reports or your peers in your team, but also with anyone who raises issues. We want them to feel included. Anyone who, as Maren just described, might be new to the team, new to a function, anything that we can do to model this behavior is what's going to help others pick it up and do it as well. So let's see how.
This is super interesting, actually, because almost 60% feel that they're effective at all three. Excellent.
Great. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then, a little bit in the middle, but a quarter feel that they need work on all three, which is fantastic. I mean, a lot of this work in psychological safety is really about sort of introspection and thinking about what it is that we do on a daily basis to
Absolutely.
create or not create.
Absolutely.
I'm going to move on because I'm looking at the time here and I don't want to run out of time at the end. So the next stage then is learner safety. Again, we all have this need to learn. We talk a lot about lifelong learners. It doesn't end in school or university. Everywhere we go, we want to learn. So that means that we need to be able to feel safe in all aspects. So that's not only asking those questions, but it's also giving and receiving feedback, it's experimenting, and it's also making mistakes. Now, for many of us, what do we tend to do when we've made a mistake? For a lot of people, I think we sort of want to sweep it under the carpet. We want to maybe hope that nobody notices. We try to cover it up. For some people, their instinct is to blame it on others. But if we have learner safety, we detach that fear from making those mistakes, and then we can instead use the mistakes as welcome signposts as we go down the road of learning. Actually, Amy Edmondson's work, a lot of her early work especially, was in hospitals, where she was looking at the safety of reporting mistakes. So for example, if you are a nurse in an operating room and you are working with someone who is the best known orthopedic surgeon in your area, and you notice that this famous well-known surgeon is about to start operating on the right knee instead of the left, do you have the safety to speak up? A lot of interesting work in her book. Now, the social exchange at this level is the encouragement to learn in exchange for engagement to learn. So which do you think goes first? Is it engagement first or encouragement first? According to the research, encouragement must be first, because all individuals bring some level of inhibition or fear or lack of confidence to a learning process. So if we expect that engagement first, a lot of people will fail. Because here is the thing, learning is both intellectual and emotional. And this was something that really was evident in my own research as well. You cannot separate the achievement or the academic learning emotions from the cognition that is required for creative and critical thinking. If you're emotionally on the defensive, not only are you not learning as well as you could, but you're also not thinking as well as you could, because an emotionally bruised learner is a cognitively impaired learner, which makes sense. I mean, if we're dealing in a work environment, even if we're dealing with personal risk in an environment of low psychological safety, how are we going to deal with learning? How are we going to admit that we don't know something if we're already on the defensive, or going out on a limb and asking that question? So the big question is, how can we increase the level of learner safety in our teams? The three suggestions here are, first of all, to model that learner vulnerability by asking questions, admitting mistakes, saying, I don't know, let's figure it out together. Because when you model vulnerability, it influences others to take risks. Secondly, we can encourage our team members in the learning process. We help motivate them and build the confidence so that we convince them to take risks, take those chances, learn things that they might not do on their own. And then finally, it's very important that we protect them when they take those learning risks and make themselves vulnerable. When we protect them, we are rewarding that vulnerability. And remember, we've said many times, people pay attention to how these vulnerable acts are reacted to. So if leaders reward the vulnerability consistently, others will notice and become more courageous and self-directed in their own learning efforts. Let's see how we all feel about how effective we are. Debbie?
Yeah, so how effective are you at providing this kind of learner safety? Are you modeling asking questions, making it okay for other people to, and are you protecting people when they ask questions, when they make mistakes? Let's see what people think.
Let's take a look.
You know, while we're doing that, I realize there's a book that I'm going to just hold it up here. Brene Brown, who you reminded me of as you were talking about vulnerability, has written this great book, Dare to Lead. So I would add that to the Debbie summer reading list.
Yeah, absolutely. So here we're seeing that half the people feel effective at all three. That's fantastic.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great.
That's great.
That's great.
Let's move to stage 3, which is contributor safety. Now, again, as I mentioned, we just, we learn and then we want to use what we've learned. So the exchange at this stage is to offer autonomy and accountability in exchange for results. Really, creating contributor safety comes down to management skills, because what we need to do is we need to explain the why, we need to assign the what, and we need to delegate the how. So in a nutshell, we need to provide clarity, direction, and the tools without micromanaging. Now, any of us who've been to business school, this was management 101, right? It's shouldn't be that difficult. However, how are we doing at it? Here's our poll relating to level 3.
Okay, how effective are you at explaining, assigning, and delegating in order to get people to contribute ideas? Push back. Oh, we're not up to pushback. Contributing ideas.
Contributing.
Yes.
Pushback is coming.
Next,
Pushback
yeah.
is coming. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a pretty even split, it looks like. Okay, wait, people are still voting.
Mm.
So a third, a third, a third, it looks like. That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually interesting how this one is so much more evenly
Yeah.
Evenly distributed than some of the other
Not
ones.
easy to, it's not easy to delegate.
It
It's not,
isn't.
you
It
know,
isn't, exactly.
especially if you're accountable for the outcome.
Well, that's it. And most people become bosses because they're good at what it is they're doing, and suddenly you have to watch someone else be doing it. It's not an easy thing. So finally, the highest level of psychological safety is challenger safety, at the top of the ladder of risk and vulnerability. Now, challenging the status quo requires intellectual bravery. As leaders, this is something that we need to encourage. We need to encourage that willingness to disagree, dissent, or challenge the status quo in a setting in which there is or could be social, emotional, political, or economic risk. In essence, to do this, leaders need to encourage it by increasing the intellectual friction while simultaneously decreasing the social friction. Because this intellectual friction is really the raw material of innovation and potentially also of integrity in strategic leadership. We need to have debate. We need to have hard-hitting dialogue sometimes. This is the social process, after all, through which we humans solve problems, we innovate, we come up with those solutions we need, and sometimes we need to do this to stand up for our morals. But the challenge is that when this intellectual friction goes up, social friction has a tendency to increase as well, because people are sensitive and emotional. They often feel strongly about their opinions and their own points of view. Additionally, leaders have a tendency to sometimes have a vested interest in the status quo, because after all, they are the reason the status quo is the status quo. They develop the structures that we're working in currently. So for that reason, many leaders can interpret a challenge to the status quo as a challenge to them personally. So they get defensive. Unfortunately, if that social friction is permitted to rise, sooner or later, it will shut down intellectual friction as well. Because when those emotions flare and people begin to criticize each other personally, people stop contributing original ideas. So how does one balance this tightrope? It's certainly not easy, but the key here is to patrol those boundaries of respect, if you will. We have to monitor and manage the social dynamics and not allow conversation to become personal or disrespectful. Because if we do, we have breach of safety, and it happens, and the costs are extensive. I'm not going to read these, but I invite you, as you read through them, to think about, does this look like the behavior of people who are engaged or creative or innovative or influencing with integrity? Do you think that someone who feels this way is going to be that person who shares the news that is hard to hear, but that we need to hear? Big question is then, how can we avoid these kinds of costs in our organization? Or let me put it to you this way, whose job is it to avoid these costs? Well, given that the team is the basic unit of performance in workplaces today, the most profound expression of culture really is at the team level, which means that the immediate supervisor has the biggest immediate influence. And of course, leadership and tone from the top has a big role to play as well. Combining this with something that I read that McKinsey just put out earlier this week, they said that 75% of Americans say that the most stressful part of their job is their boss, 75%. So clearly something needs to be done on the leadership level. And we have one more poll for this section as I wrap up and hand it back to Debbie, thinking about the leaders in your organization. Debbie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so are the leaders in your organization effective at modeling these behaviors to support psychological safety? Are they consistently effective across the board? Do you have pockets of effectiveness? Do you have few individual champions, which looks like by far the biggest circumstance? Or do you still have your training wheels on? And that's 13% as well. So um, I think that there's a great opportunity for us as ethics and compliance leaders to help them see the benefits of um, creating this kind of environment. Let's, I'm going to, thanks, Maureen. I'm going to pick up where Maureen left off. And there we go. Okay, so how do we help drive cultural change? We can now take the things that we've learned today about psychological safety, a culture of candor, speaking up, integrity and inclusion, things that have great benefits to the organization in its long-term resilience. And these concepts on the right side are the cases, if you will, the sort of the business case that we can make for creating an environment of psychological safety. So if you look at the culture as a whole, that's sort of what I've tried to diagram over there on the bottom right, as a bunch of individual people behaving and interacting with one another. And so this is me, I'm a member of that culture. My behaviors, that the things you want to change about my behavior are informed by my perceptions, right? So my upbringing, I saw a question about upbringing and you know, how do you overcome that? The things that are sort of baked into our values and our experiences and our education. Our perceptions are very powerful in driving how we behave. There are also motivations from our manager, as Marin was just talking about, the training that we get at work. And then those decisions drive how we behave, right? So perceptions lead to decisions, which lead to actions. And our actions are motivated sometimes also by external pressures. Other people watch how we behave, and other people see the results of our behavior. But if we behave, let's say, in an ethical way, and we get good results, good outcomes, then that's going to inform our perception. So our job really is to help people across the organization take this little flywheel that's going on in their brains and help them bake into their perceptions the value of psychological safety, the value of speaking up, and certainly try to influence the decisions and actions of leaders who are making it maybe harder for people in their organizations to speak up. Perception is reality. This is my dog Leo watching TV, as he often does, goes crazy when he sees dogs on TV. And there's really nothing I can do to convince him that that's not a real dog, other than going over there and sort of tapping on the TV screen so that he can see the dog doesn't move when I, you know, pet him. So we have to deal with people's perceptions. We have to influence change by influencing perceptions. How do we do that? Well, we're subject matter experts, right? We come to the conversation with credibility. Our credibility is part of our influence. The information we share is part of our influence, but our relationships, our connection, our ability to show our vulnerability, our candor, our ability to speak up, all model the kinds of things that engender trust. And trust plus expertise are the elements of how we drive those kinds of changes in perceptions. And once there are changes in perceptions, I guess you can see my little pointer, those perceptions will influence decisions and behaviors, which will influence outcomes, which people will see, which will then make us appear credible about doing the right thing and coloring inside the lines, if you will. Creating psychological safety then maybe can deliver the kinds of outcomes that we're telling leaders they can count on if they create these more vulnerable, transparent environments. Okay, our last polling question, Maren, if you want to take that one.
Last polling question, yes. So how would you describe your level of influence in driving change, both in operations and in culture? So the first option is I'm confident in my ability to influence employees to change their behavior. B, I'm confident in my ability to influence senior level decision makers to change their behavior. A and B, this is a trick question, you have to pay attention to the options. D, I'm new to driving change, but I'm looking forward to improving my influence. Or E, I'm not responsible for driving change. Just gonna take a look
Okay,
at.
well, good. The trick question was the last one, the last option there. I'm glad we have 0 on that one.
Oh, good. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we have almost half of us feeling that we're new to driving change, but we're working on it. And that's part of why we're here. So let's talk about influencing culture change. How do we go about doing it? Well, first, we have to understand that our words matter. So when we talk about people using our helpline as opposed to hotline, we're sending a message that we're there to help, that they can ask questions, that they can raise concerns, they can just ask for guidance. When we use terms like whistleblower, which I personally don't like using when it comes to internal reporting, we're sort of stigmatizing the role of speaking up. So I really prefer reporter, or my favorite is upstander, right? Because people are actually, if they're speaking up, they're doing what we've told them is their responsibility under our code of conduct. And so we want to encourage that. I don't think we encourage it by calling them whistleblowers. I also, frankly, don't think we encourage it by calling the reporting line a reporting line. I really much prefer integrity line, helpline, and so forth. The second thing that we can do is lead by example, which we've been talking about. And that means leading kind of in all directions. So we're modeling behavior not just for the teams that we lead, but even for people who are senior to us. And then finally, and this is the part that I think needs a lot of focus and sort of skill building, and that is engaging leaders to see the value in creating an environment of candor and encouraging people to speak up, meeting those 4 stages of psychological safety. How do we do that? Well, maybe they're not comfortable doing it. Maybe we can offer to facilitate a discussion with their team. There are actually fun ways to do this. Maren and I have created some exercises that can help leaders and teams create that environment. There are also some great examples in Patrick Lencioni's book, the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which I also highly recommend. Once you find those champions, and some of you mentioned that you do have champions across your organization who know how to do this, use them as examples with other leaders. I've even sort of created like a subtle competition with leaders who don't feel so comfortable being vulnerable and showing them that others are already doing these kinds of sessions with their teams. And then finally, we love doing role-playing workshops. I think that that's the best way to build muscle memory. It's sort of like the way we do crisis management and tabletop exercises. If you get people to pretend that they're in a fictional company dealing with fictional issues and fictional psychological safety obstacles, then you can get them to role play how to overcome those obstacles. And then when they're in those circumstances in real life, they can remember how they did it in the workshop. This kind of, you see, I like flywheels, information flow that feeds accountability, which feeds integrity, which then feeds results, is really kind of the visual we want to give leaders and managers in our organizations, right? We want them to see that their role in creating a culture of integrity is aligned with the value they'll get from creating this kind of psychological safety that feeds innovation and feeds their results, their strategy, their outcome. I think it's important also to put this conversation in the context of the complexity that the pandemic and the events of 2020 have sort of superimposed on the challenges we already have to creating psychological safety. I sat in on Carrie Penman and Robin Sangston's session on reporting wrongdoing, and I was fascinated. There's so much data there. If you were in one of the concurrent sessions, I highly recommend going back and listening to their session. I'm going to go back and listen to Conversant's. But they pointed out some really troubling, I would say, data that has come from their experiences with reporting, as we heard Pat talk about in the GBES data as well. Reporting externally, which is the one you see up here, is on the rise according to the NAVEX data. And that's a signal that people aren't feeling comfortable. Well, one signal is that people aren't feeling comfortable speaking up internally. That's something we have to do much more about. Pat also mentioned some of the outcomes that were very striking about the 2020 experience. This one on the left has to do with employees feeling pressure, an inordinate amount of pressure in the context that we've been living through with this pandemic, with people getting furloughed or losing their jobs. There's heightened pressure to perform. And this goes back to Marin's point about the most important thing leaders can do is create psychological safety for people to raise issues, right? The most important responsible and accountable person is the leader of the team. And then on the right, Pat also mentioned this in the keynote session just before. The huge jump in retaliation is something that we've really got to get our arms around. How we go about doing that is a challenge, right? Because we certainly can take action swiftly when someone reports it, but people aren't necessarily reporting it, or if they're reporting it, they're not reporting it to us. So some of the things that we can do would be to measure, as we do with our surveys and focus groups, and make sure we're asking about why people aren't speaking up. So did you see something, did you see wrongdoing and not report it, and why? You have to use those, you don't have to, but if you use those open box questions in a survey, you can get some very telling feedback. And then learning from the employee engagement survey, right? Because as I mentioned, especially if they're based in the Gallup 12, there will be some candor results there that can point sort of to the pockets of where the champions are and where the laggards are when it comes to leaders. Being proactive about addressing obstacles, as we've been talking about throughout. All of these things are really important, because if we don't, then employees are going to go outside. There are motivations for doing that can be financial, but I think what we know is that if we create an environment internally and employees feel that they take ownership in the company and our purpose, they're more likely to speak internally before they go outside. So how do you demonstrate that you're listening and taking action? I think that's an important piece. When people speak up, are we listening? Are we taking action? I think if you can get anonymous reporters especially to feel comfortable talking to you directly, that can really help keep them from going outside. I have some tips on that. If you want to talk on sort of offline on that, I'm happy to share those. The last thing I wanted to point out is just this week, Amy Edmondson was a co-author on an article in Harvard Business Review about what these hybrid workplaces we've created have done to psychological safety. And she lays out 5 steps about how to deal with that. So finally, I know I want to leave a little time to answer. There's like a million questions in the chat. This is just sort of a takeaway self-reflection for you on how well you think you're doing in focusing on what's essential. Do you have the skills and the strengths to create this kind of environment? And the continue, start, stop at the bottom is just a technique we use when we're reflecting ourselves. What am I doing that is working and I should continue? Is there something I've now learned that I need to start doing? Are there things I'm doing that I should stop doing? So for example, are there things that I'm doing that aren't effective? Are there things I'm doing that aren't easily connected to the strategy of the business, for example, so they can't really hear me? Those are the kinds of things we want to stop or fix. And then this is just my last thought about leadership. It's one of my favorite quotes. If we think what we're doing is effective and no one's following us, then we definitely need to start doing something different. So let's take a quick look at the questions. Maren, have you seen any?
Yeah,
I
well,
know
thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Debbie. I want to thank you also
yeah,
for
thank you,
myself
Maren.
personally. I've learned more stuff from you today.
Yeah,
There are
I
a
have
lot
learned.
of people who are participating, which is great. There's one question here. I think the first actual question Mary is asking, in a toxic environment where staff don't trust each other, is it ever possible to salvage psychological safety? Boy, that's a great question. That's an excellent question. Do you have any thoughts on that, Debbie?
Well, I think that as with most difficult questions, sometimes it's important to just hit it head on. And, if you can take someone aside and plant a seed about how to address the toxicity. I mean, we have to first, identify it, right? When we coach someone, we first have to acknowledge that an issue exists. And then what resources do we have to try to, sort of refocus the kaleidoscope and get them to see differently what they can do differently.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
completely agree. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that, the company has a culture, but each team has a culture. And even within those teams, you have little micro cultures.
Absolutely.
And those are really created by, every single interaction that we have with one other person. It's not that, I as the boss come in and treat the entire team somehow in whatever way, but it's those individual interactions. So I think those are the ways that we can very immediately influence what is
Right.
going on. And
I
as
think
Debbie said, just know that this is going on and bring it up as an issue.
I think there's another question here that relates to it, that could take us about an hour to answer, but I'm going to read it. Jeannie Montag, I was talking yesterday with an expert on change. Everyone wants to build trust, but one might argue you have to earn trust. How do you overcome a trust deficit if trust is not being earned? How do you get the collective group to show up differently? Super light question. Yeah, you're right. Super light. I would say that, if you reflect back on Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, the one habit that comes to mind is seek to understand before seeking to be understood. So as a leader, it's important to be the one who extends trust first. So, earning trust as a leader means sharing our vulnerability first. That's the Brene Brown book that I showed you. The Patrick Lencioni book, also 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, has a lot of great suggestions. But earning trust is all about actually, I know this sounds like sort of, I don't know, an oxymoron. We extend it first, and that helps us earn it. Wouldn't you agree, Maureen?
Oh, absolutely. And the other big component of that is the consistency.
Yes.
So that when
Yes.
you do extend that trust, and when you show that you are a trusting person, then you don't break down what you have built, because it takes one little breach of that, and then
Right.
you're back to square one.
Yeah,
Consistency is super
exactly.
important.
I'm gonna pretend it was Benjamin Franklin. It takes a long time to earn psychological safety and a moment to lose it. So he didn't really say it, but it was one of our great thought leaders in one of these many books. So earning it is all about laying the foundation first as a leader. That inclusion safety that Marin talked about is the foundational piece before you can climb that ladder.
Exactly right.
Okay. Well, we are out of time. Thank you all for joining us. Our contact information is here on the screen. Please connect with us in LinkedIn. We are happy to continue this conversation either on the phone or through Zoom or through LinkedIn. We have lots and lots of ideas to share with you. So bring your questions. We're happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks.